so we might as well start. So today we have our own Alex Penn. Alex did her degree here in Sussex, a PhD in the EASY group a while ago, and I think I remember you being here, but I'm not quite sure whether we overlapped or not. But then, yeah, was later at University of Surrey, and then you've worked with government and other organizations. Today we're going to learn something about complexity for society, and I think I'll leave it there and leave you to introduce yourself more thoroughly in your talk.
Thanks, Thomas. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So some of you will have seen some of this material before, and others not. But I'm just wanted to introduce myself to you already and talk to you about the work I've been doing over the last few years, as well as sort of connections I'm hoping to make here, or kind of offers, because I'm here to start rebuilding connections with Sussex. So if I can get the slides to advance. Okay. So just to say that quite a lot of the work that I'll talk about today that was done with government was done through a research centre, of which one of the co-I's, CCAN, the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity across the Nexus, big research centre co-funded with the ESRC, NERC, but also the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which is now DESNES, and Defra, as well as many other different partner organisations. So lots of different partners were involved in this policy work that I'll show you. So just to say, this is, does anyone know who this is? What this is? You know, I don't know if this still exists somewhere, but just to show you that who I am in this context, I did my PhD. I did the EASY MSc here, and I did my PhD in the CCNR. I have the bottle to prove it. Some other sort of usual suspects kind of there amongst the bottles. I noticed that Andy doesn't have a picture on his bottle, which I don't remember. I see Anil is there, and you know, Paul also, various other people. So yeah, I did an MSc here, the EASY MSc, and I stayed on to do my DPhil in major transitions in evolution, looking at the origin of evolutionary individuals through a combination of experiment, simulation, and sort of philosophy, if you like. Obviously, that was very much coming from sort of cybernetics and Sussex AI perspective. Also, I started to learn and teach permaculture design during my time at Sussex, which has been very influential on how I've approached bringing this work into government. And so since when I left Sussex, I carried on doing biology for a while at the University of Southampton and working in the lab with evolution of cooperation in microbial biofilms and major transitions inspired work. But then I ultimately ended up moving into applying sort of complex adaptive systems approaches in real world societal challenges. So I moved to the University of Surrey, firstly into the sustainability group, where on a project called the Evolution and Resilience of Industrial Ecosystems, which I'll touch very briefly on, and then in setting up CCAN, and I've been working for, well, almost a decade really in government and in wider society, doing a lot of kind of very applied on the ground work, applying complexity science tools to complex systems challenges, particularly in government, but in all sorts of real world settings. I also set up and run during that time a sort of Alife and society interest group at the conference and at the journal, and a sort of broader grouping. And for the last year, just before coming here, I accepted the job, and then I took a secondment in Defra, in the Chief Scientist's office in the systems team in Defra. So I've been embedded within government just prior to coming here, which is an interesting experience. And top secret, so I can't talk about it. But so what do I do? So I mean, I'm really interested in, a lot of my work revolves around how we use complex adaptive systems approaches to help us do something productive in real world societal challenges. And I think it's genuinely a meaningful thing to do, because a lot of the challenges that we face basically involve managing complex adaptive systems. So we're looking at, you know, the interaction of ecosystems, societies, socio-ecological economic systems, socio-technical systems, climate change, equity, agriculture, energy transition. All of these things are complex systems challenges. And decision and policy making is very difficult in these spaces because of the nature of complex systems, with the sort of unexpected indirect effects, systems that adapt as you intervene with them, non-linearities, everything that we know about complex systems. But on top of this, we don't just have a technical problem to deal with on dealing with complex systems, which we don't really have sufficient data, full data. We've also got all of these systems, anything we're dealing with in the real world is a profoundly social problem. We're always dealing with social problems, and that means that people have views on what they want to happen, people have different values, and reflexivity is a crucial part of this system. So people have their own mental models of how systems work, and their behaviour depends on those mental models. But one of the most crucial things, I think, to understand about working in this domain, which is very different to many computer science problems. So it's a bit annoying that you can't see any of the titles. I just need to press click OK, don't I? Yeah. That we're working in this domain of wicked problems. So this is maybe a term that some of you have come across. But essentially, in so-called wicked problems, the idea is that we're working with problems, social problems, complex system social problems that can't be definitively described. But really crucially, in a pluralistic society, there is no such thing as an objective optimum solution to these problems. There's no indisputable public good. People want different things and they have different objectives in these systems. So you can't have meaningfully correct or false policies in responding to societal challenges. There's no optimal solution. And there's no stopping point for these problems, right? Because they continually evolve and the world continues on and things develop. So these are really different sorts of problems to what the ones that we're used to dealing with. So solution is a kind of problematic word maybe when you're dealing with those problems. So the sorts of problems that we attempt to help people with, or I've attempted to help people with colleagues, involve interaction with and participation in complex adaptive systems. People are fundamentally parts of these systems and their behaviour changes what the system does and is. Because we're working with complex systems, we need approaches to working with processes, dynamic adaptive processes, and that's often not something that's really clearly understood in policy making. In profoundly social systems, we're in the domain of wicked problems, and always we have incomplete information about any policy problem. There's always a temptation to just focus on what you've got data for and model that, but we are always in social domains. In any real world policy problem of any kind of real import, we have incomplete information, profoundly incomplete information. Even worse, the system is always adapting in response to your policy intervention to it. So the rules of the game change as you play it. And so really we need interaction processes that take into account the properties of complex adaptive systems, but are also learning processes. So, I think our ultimate goal in this sort of scenario, or the goal that I've been trying to develop along with others, is this idea of participatory steering of complex adaptive systems. So because these are dynamic and adapting systems. So the idea being that rather than attempting to just solve problems and perfectly predict things, that we're in a constant interaction with systems, that we make interventions, that we get feedback from those systems, and that we readjust our course accordingly. And there's various kinds of sort of adaptive management approaches and learning loops that also try to capture that idea from design thinking, from permaculture, from adaptive management and others. An important part of that for me too, something that I think we can help with complex systems approaches, is a kind of idea of, and also sort of bio-inspired approaches, an idea of Aikido on systems, Aikido technologies, that we have these huge, complex, adaptive, dynamical systems that we're working with, and rather than trying to kind of push against them, that we, sort of karate style, that those systems have immense momentum and dynamics, that we do more of an Aikido style, where we're kind of, what is the kind of the point at which we can intervene with that system to move its trajectory to the place we want to go with minimum input of energy. So finding these kind of leverage or intervention points, working with the system so we can align the goals of systems with our own goals, is better than trying to kind of continually push rocks up hills in a sort of Sisyphusian style. Okay, so lots of sort of big picture stuff. I mean, one of the really important parts of this on the ground is that these are complex systems, but in actual fact, we've got a lot of great theory, we've got a lot of great tools in complexity science, and putting it into action is not necessarily just a case of kind of ever more sophisticated mathematical or computational models. People are fundamental parts of these systems, decision makers and communities and publics. And I think giving people access to the tools of complexity science and adaptive systems, you know, sort of participatory complexity, is one of the main ways that we can progress, close that gap between what we know about these systems and their actual application, you know, on the ground or in policy. So I think research really needs richer ongoing participation. And, you know, we just also have a moral responsibility if we're trying to kind of do work on societal challenges, grand societal challenges. We need to have people involved, because the solutions, if you like, or the ways of working that we come up with, the ideas and interventions we come up with, they need to have people's input, and ultimately they should be owned by the people who are part of that system. So a lot of the work I've done has been trying to bring complexity science into sort of participatory modelling approaches, participatory methods. So many of you may have come across this, others not, but essentially that there are huge amounts of work in participatory methods and in participatory modelling. And this is essentially anything which enables and encourages ordinary people to play an active and influential role in decisions and to expand their thinking through getting them involved in different sorts of decision-making methods, but also in modelling. And there's been a huge explosion in this in the last decade or so, and that, you know, forms of modelling made so that people can be included in them, both in providing input into the models and in using the models themselves. So there's lots of different methods, lots of different approaches to this. The process here of getting people involved in building and understanding and analysing models is really valuable in its own right, to get people actually understanding their own system and having ownership of the models that are being used to develop interventions for their system, rather than just being the subjects of that. And it's also a really kind of useful approach if you want to do more than just kind of tweak a system as it is. By having people involved in modelling their system and understanding its fundamental structure and dynamics, it does open up possibilities that we can do what's called sort of double and triple order learning, in which people understand that their structure of their system actually needs to change and the dynamics need to change. So rather than just kind of changing parameters in a pre-existing system, you can actually start to think about how you might restructure a system. Okay, so there's lots of preamble. A little bit more preamble, but getting more to the point, I think. Done a lot of work using these ideas and applying them in complexity and public policy, in CCAN and as a consultant, and in recent years working directly inside government. And all sorts of domains of activity. I've done a lot of work in sustainability, environment and agriculture, in particularly with Defra, the Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, with Natural England, and with the Environment Agency, and a lot of stuff on marine policy. I've done a lot of work on energy policy, energy transition, and all sorts of other things, like the Department for Transport, the Ministry of Justice, the Office for Environmental Protection, lots and lots of work in policy in different domains, but all complex systems problems. And there have been a kind of real fashion for complexity thinking in government, which sort of comes and goes. I mean, there's various waves at which systems thinking comes into government, complexity thinking comes into government. But the kind of real problem that you encounter here is that the problems that people are trying to deal with in policy, they're not kind of simple complex systems problems, they're not free body problems. The problems themselves have really complicated structure. So this is the obesity foresight map, which was, I've done about 10 years ago. It's really worth looking up these maps. So it's a causal loop diagram that's done by the Foresight team. There are a whole number of different maps of this sort that were done on sort of land use, on obesity, on various other complex problems. in combination with working with a lot of experts. And the idea was to kind of provide these big systems approaches to kind of core wicked policy problems. So this is obesity. You can see in the middle that the energy balance, the kind of straightforward calories in, calories out model. And if you look, so just to explain what a causal loop diagram is, we'll see a lot of these systems maps. Basically, every factor here is basically a variable, and an arrow or a line with a box on the end means an influence, a causal relationship between these different variables. So this map, it spans, and it cannot by any means be said to be exhaustive, but it spans a huge number of domains. So, you know, you have really interesting broad impacts in here on the kind of main engine of metabolic metabolism and individual physical activity. So you have hugely broad things, like, for example, increased numbers of women working, sort of leading to time poverty, leading to increased reliance on convenience foods, all feeding into obesity. You have the dominance of car culture and lack of walkability of neighbourhoods, all of course driven by planning policy, but you know, removing people's desire to do active travel or kind of everyday activity. You have things like social change, like the lack of acceptance of smoking, leading to, well, more stress, according to this map. You're not smoking, leading to more eating. And you have like huge changes in sort of workplace dynamics and the way we all live and work, leading, but ultimately, you won't be surprised here, probably, through the immediate mode of stress, the variable of stress, to perceived lack of time, to overeating. So you've got enormously broad societal changes in this map, and it covers a huge number of different domains of policy responsibility. It might not surprise you to hear that this is commonly referred to as the horrendogram. And there's really interesting work that social scientist Sedlacko in particular did in following this up, how it was used in policy. And in general, people just found it overwhelming. It gave them an excuse to say, it's not my area of responsibility. I can't possibly do anything about this because it's too big. So it sort of kind of created a paralysis, you know, the exposure of this complexity or complicatedness, you might say, rather than, you know, anything that people could act on. Yeah.
Waiting on the different, you're doing a process of.
Well, I did not do that, Matt, but no, I mean.
No, but I mean, is there a waiting? So what's important, or is it all equally?
That version, everything's equal, but it's very common, yes, to do a weighting of like what's more important or not,
Yes,
not more important. Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, so you can do either. It depends. Yeah, it's quite common to do both. And you analyse them differently, obviously. A causal loop diagram is commonly used as a basis for a sort of systems dynamics model, and so you would have to sort of do kind of more formal definition for that kind of model, and it's quite commonly done.
Sorry, another just a quick question in general. Are these things normally formulated as a kind of top-down or as a kind of bottom-up by experts talk about individual connections and then it gets put together, or some comes in?
It really, so it's normally done in workshops. So that one was done with kind of multiple expert group workshops. There's all sorts of different ways you can do it, but they're done in groups. These are participatory processes. So I should have said that that's something that's created, but with experts. I mean, so there's different modes where you're doing something with an expert group and when you're doing something with lots of different people on the ground and you're capturing on the ground knowledge. That one was more of a kind of bringing together the academic literature, essentially, those foresight maps. But I'll show you some examples that will make it a bit clearer how they've done differently. Okay, so on top of this, so you're working also, you know, the reality of the policy making process when you're trying to kind of put complex systems tools in place and fit them together for people. You've got these really complicated problems, but you've also got all these organizational constraints that make it really difficult. So policy often happens really rapidly. You'll be told you have to deliver something to the minister within 4 hours. That's true, right? Or, you know, more commonly, it might be a month or 3 weeks, something like that. So and priorities change all the time. I was in government when new government came in, everything changed completely, overnight changes. And even within government, something's pulled, the mood changes, things, you have to just be changing all the time. Think about, a kind of really big detailed model that you're developing over 5 years is not really kind of very immediately usable in that context. You've got it in the drawer maybe, but you can't use it to answer immediate policy problems. You're always in a situation of data scarcity. And usually you may have data for some small part of the system, and you don't want people's attention just to be focused on decision making around where they've got quantitative data and ignoring the other stuff they know is important that they haven't captured. You've got time and resource scarcity to a really high degree. So it's really difficult to kind of do experimentation, reflection, to kind of really do an adaptive management style approach, which is really our optimum for working with complex systems. Departments and teams extremely siloed. Even in the same team on the same floor, quite often when you're bringing people together to do systems mapping, it's just to get them to understand that the biggest thing that comes out of it for them is that they understand what the other guys are doing who are on down the corridor, and the fact that it might be directly clashing or interacting with what they're doing, and they need to know about it. But you've got real silo working and competition between departments too, because they're all fighting in a struggle to survive and, to keep their funding, which doesn't help when you've got big challenges that cross different domains. And you've got a lot of limited bottom-up communication. People are moving around all the time in the civil service, which means that there's a poor institutional memory, that it's hard to sort of to learn things. There's obviously values and politics. You're not just kind of doing science in a value-free context. And there's an incredible importance placed on how the media responds to any policy decisions. So like what the Daily Mail is going to say about something is actually something that's really, really important to policymakers. So, you're in a quite challenging environment. And when we set up CCAM, we were in a really lucky position. We got funding from the research councils and co-funded by government, but with a very open brief to kind of work on live policy issues with complex systems tools as became evident were appropriate. But because we were working on live policy, we didn't have to say in advance, this is the research we're going to do. We had this process planned out and, in the grant where we were going to have these conversations. Government wanted complex systems work, but we didn't know what were going to be live policies, and we didn't know what was going to be the best thing to do. So we were really lucky in the structure of the grant, and it made all the difference, I think. So we started off at the beginning of this research centre with a lot of conversations with policymakers on the type of complex systems challenges that they had, but also on their sort of organisational constraints. And we really ended up sort of honing in on participatory systems mapping, despite the fact we had lots of different modelling and expertise within the team, of all sorts, but it actually became very popular to do participatory systems mapping that I'd already been working on in the Humber region of the UK with local communities in energy transition. And it was really interesting sort of having those conversations. But the reason why we decided we were going to do this is everyone knew that the policy interventions were acting on a complex adaptive systems. They'd seen a lot of evidence of unexpected indirect effects. They knew that things were kind of maybe having impacts, they were being impacted on from stuff that's happening outside their domains of responsibility. They knew that they had a particular problem with lots of interacting policies with overlapping aims, or how those things are all interacting together. And that policy is always going into a domain where you've got lots of other interventions, lots of other processes already happening. So that's where you are. And you've got a big diversity of stakeholders, and those people are really important to how policy actually gets implemented. And they wanted something quick and cheap, so that they were kind of interested in indirect effects with kind of where the system boundaries were, this kind of thing, not so much in the sort of dynamics. So we brought this method, participatory systems mapping, in, and this, to many of you who do mathematical modelling, this might not really look like a modelling method. It's a workshop method, producing the kinds of maps that I showed you with the obesity foresight map. So basically, you get people together in a room, and we do have online interfaces doing this as well, but I think the gold standard is really getting people together in a room. You define a system, and you're thinking, okay, who are the actors in that system? Who do I need to bring into a room? And you get those people to just collaboratively construct a systems model of their view of the system, its components and drivers, the interdependencies between them. So this map is made up of factors in the system and causal connections between them. And this is a really sort of simple example. This is actually the first one I did, it's very small. And this is in Humber, which is a kind of big industrial region in the north of the UK, responsible for a large amount of the UK's CO2 emissions, large amount of power production, chemical industries. Working with industrialists, the ports, the local authorities up there to think about bio-based economy and the transition to bio-based energy production, amongst other things. This is a map that they produced. It has a single focal factor or outcome here that they're focusing on. We tend to do many more in actual fact than one, but this is bio-based economy, the energy produced from bio-based economy. And all of these things around it these are what they consider to be the key variables that are impacting that factor or are impacted by it. And you can just see from looking at this some of the kind of crucial things about this kind of model. So it does contain, nicely quantifiable variables like fossil fuel price, but it also contains things that are very qualitative, like community acceptance of new industrial development. Okay, but that they consider to be highly important, whether people object to the planning commission and mount campaigns against their plants, that's something that matters. We don't have a kind of quantitative measure of that. It's a sort of social factor. It's got policy in it, it's got the availability of feeds, of useful kind of byproduct feedstocks, it's got the state of technology, current state of existing industries, land availability, all sorts of different things, multiple domains, and then causal connections between them. Now, each of these arrows is a causal mechanism which is discussed and described by the people in the group. Quite often people disagree about what these are, but you have a process of conversation where people express their mental models about what they think is happening in a system and how. So it's not just, this is kind of something to do with this. People have to go and describe mechanism. And a positive arrow basically means we usually just have positive, negative, and complex, even though we'll have the mechanism captured. Positive means they change in the same direction. So if international instability goes up, then fossil fuel price goes up. If international instability goes down, fossil fuel price goes down. Negative, for example, is the amount of infrastructure being built, like pylons, roads, etc., increases. The community acceptance for new development will decrease. That's their feeling. So these are what we call intersubjective models. These are things that people think are happening on the ground. Okay, so is that sort of relatively clear what these things are? Yeah.
Yeah, is there ever any scope for like a U-shaped relationship between two variables?
I'd be really keen to actually do a workshop where we have different types of relationships of that sort, have little cards and see how that would fly with people actually. Yeah, so that, conditional, normal distributions, whatever it might be. I'm quite keen to try that, but I haven't actually ever done it in a workshop. Yeah. So, yeah.
Obviously, you've got 20 in which there could be 500.
Yeah, and I'll show you one with 600 in about 2 minutes' time.
So the point of the question is, do you try and get those 500 compressed into more general 20, or do you never discard something because you say, well, it's probably not going to have much effect, so we'll forget?
We do both of those things. I'll show you how we analyze them. Right, I'll go through that. I mean, there's different ways of doing it. And just to say that a lot of people have just done a process where they transform maps like this into sort of really simple difference equations with a sigmoid sort of stuck on everything, but you've got these kind of incremental variables here. And we started doing that as that was the sort of common analysis that was done in what's called fuzzy cognitive mapping. But you very quickly start to see that the answers that you're getting out of like what's driven high and what's driven low is actually more dependent on like the slope of your sigmoid than on the structure of the network. And the only real data you've got is actually the structure of your network. So this is why we moved into a different form of analysis, which I'll show you. But I mean, you've got to be quite wary. There's a lot of people turning these things into models. And then once it's kind of a model coming out on the computer screen, it looks very convincing, but it could just be complete gibberish. So I kind of moved away from that. I'll show you, I'll kind of whip through. But anyway, when we use these maps, really, they're really useful when we've got intersecting issues from different domains, qualitative and quantitative factors, lots of different interdependencies between system components, and also really where you've got like different stakeholders or actors in the system who have knowledge of different parts of the system and different perspectives. And in particular, where they may have on the ground knowledge of some part of the system, but they don't know about, this bit over here. So you can bring together all of that diverse knowledge and construct collectively a whole system model. It really helps people themselves in kind of actually clarifying their own mental models about what's happening. There are lots of cases, of course, where people have completely different views, mental models about how things are working on the ground, and that in itself is useful and interesting and has to be managed in these processes, but it can actually be something you can use. People have completely different mental models of how systems work. But it's something that's really helpful to kind of get people together to build collaboration and a kind of collective ownership of their system. And you can use it where you've got detailed local knowledge, expert knowledge, you know, on the ground knowledge. Describing expert, I think, is something a bit different to what it might be considered in other circles, where you haven't got empirical data, and you can do it pretty quickly. You can do it in a couple of days. And we get out of this, we really do get, you get people kind of getting an overview of the whole system and the interactions, and you have this through this process of discussion that you're facilitating understanding, a collective understanding, a new understanding of the system, where they are in it, what they're interacting with and who. And you can really kind of bring in voices that wouldn't normally get to be part of these processes, you know, clarify mental models and do all this great stuff, like kind of producing collective ownership and kind of people getting these aha moments about the fact that they're in the system, what the system looks like, what else is in the system. It's a really useful thinking tool in its own right. But we have really pushed to develop sort of meaningful and usable analysis and insights out of these maps, more than just a kind of good, useful process. You want to have both, but you can actually get sort of actionable insights from them. And really throughout the course of working extensively with government, and particularly with Defra over a couple of years, sort of formalise, you know, I gave it the name afterwards, this actionable complexity framework. And this is really in sort of response to trying to kind of get away from this. We've got this fantastic complex systems model, but it's an overwhelming complexity. So most problems look like that. How do we move from an overwhelming system complexity to an actionable complexity? And the rules that I've got for this are that, and you know, I'm really open to kind of interesting input and discussion about this, but stakeholder owned and constructed models which capture what matters on the ground. Analysis, obviously there's a lot of thinking involved in all these steps. Analysis which both highlights key practical implications of system complexity, but also challenges users' assumptions. So the people you've commissioned, you highlight practical implications, and that's a sort of gateway for you actually challenging how they think about their system or what's going on. And so facilitating an ongoing process with users asking new types of questions and generating new analysis ideas themselves as their complexity proficiency increases. So throughout your modelling process, you want to be building people's complexity literacy or complexity proficiency, so that by the end of the process, they've got something that they're going to go forward with themselves, and then they're thinking differently. They're thinking about complex systems in a different way. So I'll step you through with one big example. This is the biggest map that I've done. This is working with Defra on post-Brexit policy. So basically, we're leaving the European Union, and huge amounts of agricultural policy coming back to the UK. So kind of 70% of the policy coming back. And all of this was happening very quickly. All of the policy had to be redone. You know, and we had a kind of really interesting time in Defra in which there was a real appetite for change under Michael Gove, funnily enough. But all Defra policy deals with complexity and complex systems. There's this huge change going on. There's a kind of desire to kind of reframe the way agricultural policy was made to make it support environmental stewardship. And we were brought in by the Future Farming and Countryside team in the analysis division of Defra. And they had a kind of interesting client brief. They wanted to do this. They wanted to look at everything, all of Future Farming and Countryside in a gigantic map, and you know, how to make new policy and how to evaluate new policy, you know, in this new regime. But they also wanted 4 separate policy maps, and these are sort of policy teams. They wanted combining into one. So we had environmental land management, agricultural productivity and resilience, rural communities and animal and plant health, the specific policy areas they wanted to have maps for also. And of course, they're very short of time. And we're trying to do something here, which we've got stakeholder owned and constructed models which capture what matters on the ground. And this involves a little bit of kind of sleight of hand, if you like. So to capture what matters on the ground for them, we've got all of the policy analysts involved, we've brought people on board, and the map starts from, rather than one focal factor, like the bio-based energy production, multiple outcomes of this system, which are policy outcomes, like all of the things they want, and prioritise, still leaving you with hundreds of policy outcomes, a large number of policy outcomes. But it's also clear that in the agricultural system, when you're looking at agriculture, rural communities, land management, it really matters what the farmers want, what the people in rural communities want, what the land managers want and their drivers, and the outcomes that matter to them. But Defra is really averse to kind of bringing those people into a room and talking. I mean, they want a safe space to talk about new policy, so in some senses that's fair enough, but your ideal would be to kind of have everyone in there understanding what's happening together. So just to try to kind of get those voices on the table, we ran preliminary workshops, getting them to think about what different stakeholders' outcomes or functions of the UK future farming and countryside system might be. So what do farmers want? What do environmental land managers want? What do rural communities want, etc. So we have a set of variables that capture those interests also. Then a really large workshop with a kind of quite complicated structure to ensure that we could have 4 different policy maps. We'll also be able to merge them by agreeing collectively the variables we're going to use, and having a structure where people went round to look at different maps halfway through and think about how their policy area connects. So we generate 4 maps, we connect them, and then we have a lot of kind of verification activities, digitising our maps, lots of verification, lots of surgeries, lots of different kind of ways of getting more feedback on the maps, exposing who else needs to feed into the map, where we've got things wrong, where we've got disagreements. And through this kind of long co-production process with the evaluation team, putting together something that looks like this. So, I mean, that really is a herendogram, the highest order. So that has our 4 policy areas and also all of the interconnections that we could come up with between them. And you have these yellow blobs, our policy outcomes, the red circles are stakeholder outcomes. These can be things people do want or don't want, the variables that are important to them. The white circles are just general factors, variables in the system, and then the blue is our policies. And another sort of thing that was really important in this process, and is always really important actually when you're working with government, is that you really force people to build the system first and not put their policies on till the end, because there's a real sort of, you'll often get this kind of, okay, well, here's my policy and here's the outcome I want, and this is a direct line between it, right? So you're trying to get people to think about the whole system, the extant system that they're actually working on. So you're just forcing people to hold back. So this simple sort of manipulation you're doing, where you're trying to kind of understand the cognitive biases of the people that you're working with and trying to design processes that work with that too. But we've got this gigantic map, 600 factors, but 2,000 interactions. And obviously, there's nothing you can do very easily directly with that, apart from go to your boss and say, look, this is a really difficult problem that you've given me to work on. I need more than 4 hours. So, I mean, it does actually have a use, showing complexity, but we really want to do here sort of analysis that highlights practical implications of system complexity and also sort of starts to challenge people's assumptions. That's a really key part of this. So we tried the way that we came up with to move from this overwhelming complexity to the actionable complexity was to start pulling out submaps from these models. So you can define, you start from a factor in the map, and this could be something that's suggested by stakeholders, like it's a policy intervention they want to make, it's an outcome they care about, it's something that they're worried is going to change, or system suggested. And because of the problems with turning these into dynamical models, which we did initially as a sort of standard, we started to develop ways to do this with network analysis, because then it's fairly transparent what you're doing. So we did start using sort of network controllability, but that was a bit too tempting for policymakers. So if you sort of mention control nodes of a network, then that's kind of, you see this, yeah, you're taking people down a path that's probably not that useful to go down. So we went back to more straightforward centrality analysis of, more kind of conventional types. So looking for nodes in the network that are more structurally important. But what's really crucial when you're doing this is to kind of do this in a meaningful way and to combine it with subjective information factors, like what's most important to who, what's vulnerable, what's likely to change. So we pull out submaps, and I'll give you some kind of straightforward examples. We have a sort of a little kind of toolkit of ways that we can pull out submaps from these gigantic maps that answer particular questions. And these submaps are then a starting point for a structured discussion, and it's fully transparent what's in the model. You're not just giving people an answer. So there's lots of things you can do with this analysis, and I'll go back through this later if people are interested. But always when you're choosing your analysis, you're not just saying, well, I've done a kind of, this is your high betweenness centrality node, there you go. We're structuring our analysis, the way we're presenting it is framed with questions that are going to make sense to the users. So these are questions that our colleagues, our collaborators in the insights and evaluation team for future farming came up with as being meaningful to their deputy director. So what might be a risk for the future farming programme? What might be an opportunity or a policy lever? What trade-offs might exist in the programme? How might an intervention affect the system? And then the kind of what else you be thinking about. So we don't go in presenting it as a network analysis, we go in presenting it as things that have clear meaning for policy, because you're always in a situation where you've got to kind of just make the case for what you're doing being meaningful at all. But there's some just like nice examples that came out of this. So just from our very first pass analysis, just looking at centralities. So in that gigantic map, the highest out degree node was digital connectivity. And here you can see a sort of one step downstream of digital connectivity. And if you look 2 steps downstream, you'll see this to an even greater degree, but you've got lots of outcomes here. So in 1 step away, there's lots of red outcomes that matter to farmers, land managers. And you've got some policy outcomes here too. And if you move 2 steps away, you've got even more things that matter. So, out degree is quite commonly talked about as being influence, but this is a sort of meaningful influence. That's what I would mean by sort of subjective network analysis that we try to do. It's meaningfully influential, but okay, is that a kind of lever or is it a vulnerability for your policymaker? So we look upstream of that factor, and this is really striking to people. So what's the only things that are directly upstream from that factor are policies, but none of them are policies that are owned by Defra, right? They're owned by the Treasury, they're owned by other government departments. So they're completely dependent on the industrial strategy and on the other government departments, effectively implementing those policies to produce this high-speed rural broadband and high connectivity on which all sorts of systems that lead directly into their policy outcomes depend. So they've got enormous vulnerability in the system there. And it's quite useful to kind of pull out something like this initially, because it just, people are like, okay, yes, I've sort of been thinking about this, I've been half thinking about this, it makes sense to them. But then you've got something that you can use. So what they actually do, they can sort of illustrate they've got this vulnerability and why. And then using this map or the downstream, sort of 2-3 steps downstream to policy outcomes, they went through a systematic process of saying, where could we buffer all of those connections, against this dependency on connectivity? Like, where can we make things downloadable? Where can we make it available in paper form or an alternative form? So it kind of functions as a practical design, starting point for design of policy delivery there. So that was directly used in design of policy delivery. And this is another one that was sort of unexpected to them, I think. It's just another straightforward centrality, like the highest betweenness centrality node in that map is the number of farmers taking up the environmental land management scheme, sort of really large policy initiative to try to produce ecosystem services and get payments for ecosystem services on farms that some of you might have heard of. It's got a very high between us centrality. It's also got a very high out degree. And you can see clearly, you don't need to see the labels, just 2 steps away from this, there are a huge number of policy outcomes that are influenced really only by this factor. They're very dependent, these policy outcomes, on that scheme, possibly unsurprisingly. But maybe what's more important than that is that because it's got a high between us centrality, it's only really fed into by a couple of things. Farmer and land manager willingness to change, farmer and land manager ability to change, which have sort of quite similar connections. But when you look at what's feeding into those, you see a lot of stuff that's some of it just constraints that farmers cannot do anything about, like the nature of their tenure, the size of their farm, their economic circumstances. You see a lot of social stuff, like around the actions of opinion leaders, around social and cultural factors, and how you see yourself as a farmer, and your risk aversion and lack of autonomy. You've got, you haven't got any policies, and you've got only a few sort of policy-related things. You see a lot of social, cultural aspects, and a lot of like really hard constraints. So that might be a real problem for that policy, given how dependent your outcomes are on policy. So then they use this to justify commissioning a piece of social science work, where they actually went and did more discussion with farmers about what would make it possible for uptake of that scheme. I wouldn't say it's been a resounding success overall, but the Elm scheme has had a lot of problems. But this is really important to sort of say to people and to kind of use to justify to people that we need to do the social science before we can get the policy to work, because this policy is so dependent on the situation of farmers and their desire or willingness to do it. So really very directly sort of usable. But moving through that, so these are just kind of things that we produced for them. We really started to try and get into this idea. We were working very closely with the analysis team, and training them up throughout this whole process in doing systems mapping themselves and in doing analysis themselves. And we had people who were very keen to do that, so we were lucky with that. But getting them into asking new types of questions, generating new analysis ideas as their complexity and proficiency increased. And so they just started to sort of do their own thinking around this, asking for what they wanted and then starting to do things themselves. So, a really key thing for them, for example, was to look at trade-offs between sort of core policy outcomes. Where are the synergies between policy outcomes? Where are the trade-offs that we can't get around, or what would we need to do if we want all of these policy outcomes? Where are the problems? So that was a kind of just very simple thing that they wanted, but they could see would be impactful in the conversations they were having. And then we had all sorts of kind of quite interesting things that were about the internal culture of the organisation. So here we're looking upstream, like factors and links feeding into total factor productivity, which is a kind of common economic variable that you talk about in agriculture. And what was sort of interesting about this is that we had a lot of different expertises in our workshops. People who worked on the ground in all sorts of different domains, in environment and ecology, looking at skills and looking at issues around migration. But we also had the agricultural economists who are sort of insistent that what needs to go into total factor productivity is simply the sort of straightforward total factor productivity equation. So it's the cost of inputs, the amount of inputs, the yields, the price of outputs, and you could just calculate the total factor productivity. But rather than just everyone feeling, suppressed by the economists yet again, we're telling them that, it's very, very simple. What the team were able to do is to restructure the map to make sure that those variables were in there, but to ensure that we have connections between all of the other more nuanced contextual concerns that the other expert policy teams knew were going on, which show how they influenced the kind of economic contextual, the economic story. So again, it's about kind of translating that complexity into a form that you can see, this does make a difference to you. This makes a difference to your model of the system. This makes a difference to how you behave in your decision making. It's just straightforward. It's very useful to do this. What else feeds into my policy outcome? Quite often people are thinking about these things feed into my policy outcome, these things feed into my policy outcome, and they're not thinking about all the rest. It's directly usable sort of risk analysis, really. And then, really nicely, they really kind of went for it. They ended up with someone who was in post with the responsibility of looking after the systems map, which had a named post on systems mapping. And they started to put together, so I don't know if you've ever come across logic models, but I mean, in policy, good practice in policy, and the business case for a policy, which you have to produce, is to have some kind of logic model, which is essentially a sort of simple linear hypothesis of how what you're doing is going to lead to an outcome and steps in between. So they were able to kind of unify the logic models that already existed, these policy domains, but also pull out the context from the map. So essentially kind of find those logic models within the map. So find multiple logic models for the whole program within the map, but then directly visually able to say, here are the risks, here are the feedback loops, here are the other things that might be impacted by this logic model. So here is how we need to think differently, but framed very much in a language that their superiors would understand. So again, it's making that super direct connection to how they currently work and showing how the complexity means you have to think somewhat differently about that. So that was one really successful case study. I think, it took us about 2 years working all together, although the workshops really were done pretty rapidly, in a couple of months at the beginning of that process, but working with the teams and designing analysis and then kind of designing their own analysis from that was extended in quite a period. And what was really made this work is it's this actionable complexity process that I talked about, but it's having an iterative process in which you're able to change what you're doing. You're building capacity of the people you're working with throughout. You're training them to do the modelling. You're training them to sort of think as complex system scientists. You're training them to do the analysis. And then they can start to take it on themselves. They can run workshops themselves. They can come up with new forms of analysis. And you end up with a living document, essentially. So that model is still in use within Defra, because we didn't just hand over a report as experts or a model that people couldn't use. We train people in how to use it, but also to change it and take ownership of it. And that, I think, is really crucial in making long-lasting change in these kinds of situations. So, and I think rather than doing some modelling work for people, what I think about when I think I'm doing something like this is I think I'm guiding people on an unfolding complexity journey. So co-production processes, because what you really want is a sustainable change in thinking and doing, that your tools can be used and people have changed the way they think. So that means you've got to really listen and understand people's context and their challenges, as well as their blind spots, what they're not thinking about and what you need to guide them towards. And obviously be prepared to kind of be challenged on that. What aspects of complexity they're dealing with. The systems mapping works for certain kinds of contexts and certain kinds of challenges. It's not going to work for everything. And many other forms of modelling are useful and exist here. So it's important to kind of go into that process being open-minded about what's going to fit both the nature of the sort of the complex systems challenges and the contextual challenges. So not just I've got my tool and I use it everywhere. In these processes, you really need to work for people to have the first time they interact with you in a workshop to sort of learn something, to go, oh wow, okay, I haven't thought about that before, and I can see why it's meaningful to me. So your process is really trying to kind of get that in, but then also very much from the beginning, show why it's meaningful to how they're thinking, actionable insights. And so this co-design analysis, designing the capacity building and transferring the ownership and having these models as living documents. And really you're aiming to have processes that have a life of their own. So I've got loads more. We've got an hour. I got sort of
5 minutes left.
5 minutes left.
Sorry.
Okay. Well, I can tell you there's lots of different other systems mapping processes that I can tell you about with interesting different sort of findings and how we can use them. But just worth saying that systems and complexity approaches are really, they have a lot of traction in government. The sort of Defra systems research program that was started in 2019, which led to the formation of Defra systems research team. Systems thinking in government, huge network with hundreds of people kind of going to seminars and training all the time. There was a big initiative on kind of designing systems thinking toolkits for civil servants from the Government Office of Science and Technology. But what they still really need to do is to sort of, a lot of this is focused on policy evaluation, this kind of thing, in that bit, just because of where it sits. And there's a real need still, I think, to kind of move it into policy design and to get sort of more whole, really kind of get more serious about doing complex systems thinking. So yeah, I guess I would say there's a huge environment, there's a huge enthusiasm for the innovative practice. And when people do this kind of work, they start to think differently about how their organization should be structured, how policy making should be structured, how analysis should be structured. They start to see the need for sort of adaptive teams focused around challenges, or even doing a systems map to decide who should be in your team for a challenge, and then starting to work in that way in adaptive teams. They start to really see that the organization needs to be different. But it's like how to kind of move on from that is a big question. I mean, for me, I think, this does really quickly, when you're doing this kind of stuff, there's lots of stuff for us to systematize, to try the kinds of things that Adam's talked about. It often shows you the need for new models. You've got to really sort of stop thinking that this is it as regards to modeling, and you've got the map and that's the kind of definitive object, kind of getting people comfortable with the fact that you've got these quick and dirty models and you've got radical uncertainty all the time in these systems. That's something that's sort of difficult to do unless people are kind of prepared to put the time into thinking about the process and understanding it. I think we are really not yet at this position where we can do policy design this way, or we haven't maybe just been working. And that's mainly actually because in government, the policy profession is separate from the analysis profession. So you specialize in policy, or you specialize in evidence analysis science. You don't do both. So we've mainly had a lot of traction with evidence and analysis. So the people who are kind of more geeky kind of really love this stuff. And we really need to get traction in the policy profession. And I would say that, interestingly too, that sort of systems maps, there's some great systems mapping work that's been done in government by government teams. But you quite often see that what they'll do is a map that's, here's our policy intervention, and we are going to look at potential barriers to the uptake of that implementation. But they'll start from the policy intervention, whereas what we would really like to get people to get to the point of is like, what's the system? What are the outcomes that people care about? And then looking for the sort of points in that system where you could have co-benefits of an intervention, where there are leverage points, and maybe even definitely rethinking what your intervention should be led by the nature of the system, rather than you using systems thinking tools to just sort of, work out, can I make this poorly thought through intervention a bit less, can I remove barriers to that? So sort of interventions that really work with the system, and Aikido type of interventions, we're not really quite there yet with where this is done in government. Okay, so I haven't got time to talk about AI in this, but I would say, just on the sort of poorly chosen interventions, I was going to talk through sort of issues around like choosing the wrong place to apply your technology, right? It's like, so I think none of you are probably doing stuff like this anyway. So why shouldn't we replace pollinators with robots? Because it's likely to have extreme negative impacts and be extremely costly. And there are lots of cheap ways that we already know how to do this, support pollinator populations. But we have to deal with tricky social, political, and economic stuff to make that happen. So I think there's something really important for all of us working in AI, working in robotics, to not just think, oh, here's a tricky social problem or a political problem that we haven't got traction with. I'm going to kind of solve it with my technological solutions without thinking about the system and the context, why it's difficult, whether the solution is actually workable, whether it causes other negative impacts. And, essentially, I think we've got to be really wary of tech solutions to social and political problems. And I see them a lot, not when we're recording, but I can talk to you about some egregious examples I've seen of that. And I think we're really well placed here at Sussex with our sort of whole systems, Alife and complex systems background to do really thoughtful AI and robotics, in which you think first, okay, what's the system? What are the challenges? Where could these tools really effectively fit? You know, and where do we need the social sciences? Where do we need collaboration? Where is this about politics? You know, and I think we should be really taking on that mantle of thoughtful AI development for societal challenges, because we really have got the kind of skills and background to do that, I think, here in Sussex. So that would be my my final thing. I think I won't go through any of that. Yeah, I think there's a lot of background here for us to do that, and I'd love to talk to people about that, and as well as kind of any of my other interests in the origins of individuality, in interacting with complex adaptive systems in weird and wonderful ways, and of course with policy. But I think the big thing here is like, how can we use complex adaptive systems approaches? How can we do thoughtful AI to engage with societal challenges alongside other disciplines in a sort of humble and appropriate way, rather than a kind of our brains are going to solve your problems. That's a role for us, I think. Okay, thanks. Sorry for talking right up to the line.
Alex, you have a question on Zoom?
What is the question? Can you read it? I can't see it.
Yeah, for policy makers, in addition to scientific evidence and stakeholder engagement, is there a clear role for cultural common sense and gut instinct in navigating actionable complexity systems? Is there aha moment linked to this?
Maybe if I stop sharing, I'll be able to see the chat, because that's quite a long question.
I know.
Which is good. Policymakers, in addition to scientific evidence and stakeholder engagement, is there a clear role for culture, common sense, and gut instinct? Yes, there is. You know, I think this is really interesting. I think in policy you get a lot of kind of evidence or modelling being brought in to support people's preconceived ideas or their common sense or their gut instinct. But I think there's like a really interesting area of work around people's understanding of complex adaptive systems. And you know, Nick and I have been involved in some proposals that haven't got funded on this, of trying to give people a more embodied understanding of how complex systems behave. I think there's an interesting role for AI here too, in how to use AI to kind of open up your kind of understanding of, or kind of awareness of the complex systems around you, rather than shut it down. Because I do think it's really worth trying to help people develop different kinds of gut instincts or common sense around complex systems, because that's not our natural way of thinking, and that's problematic. But I think we can, like there are people who manage enormously complex farms successfully and adaptively. There are people who practice statecraft. There are people who I think there's quite a lot of evidence, and interesting evidence, for people being able to kind of develop their capacity to gain a kind of intuition around complex systems that is much larger than their intuition around themselves. And again, I think that's another kind of interesting thing for COGS to look at, because it's probably a sort of social cognition faculty. But I think giving people the tools and connections so that they can develop that is a really interesting area of work. But yeah, like gut instinct can be problematic, but you can change what your gut instinct is, I suppose, is the summary of that. But I mean, having said that, you'll find in any of these workshops that there are people who are already thinking that way, and it makes an absolutely natural sense to them. And it's not to do with educational level or anything like that, because you find it just working on the ground with people in communities who've, not had a job in 10 years. They're really this kind of visual mathematical way of working makes sense to them. And there'll be professors for whom they just can't grasp it. So, but I think, there are people who are sort of systems thinkers, and those are really helpful people to kind of try to help support their thinking and extend their thinking. So that was a long answer, but I don't know. Yeah, it's fun.
I have loads of questions, but the one thing that kind of bugged me the whole talk, right, is that your models don't look like they're actually quantitative enough to predict anything. real, right?
Yeah.
So if you were to try to run this forward with some intervention
Yeah.
and say, oh, I'm gonna do this to this connection here.
Yeah.
Is it actually going to get anything right just based on people having thoughts about what might influence what positive or negatively?
Well, but I
with
think,
some
I think,
rough rating?
I think so. Okay, so
Can that
what
ever be enough?
can that ever be enough?
If I
Well,
were to predict it, also to take more conversion, if I were to predict the weather that way,
Yeah.
I would totally fail. I would have kind of prediction of an hour in advance.
Yeah.
Because I see the clouds coming and that's
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
I wouldn't get any further than that.
So I think there are different kinds of systems for which this is useful, right? So we can do really great models of the weather because, well, that it's hard to do it still, but these are not social systems,
Yes,
right?
you have more data.
Yeah, we have data systems, we have well-defined physics. For, very, very many of the links in those maps, we do not have any kind of well-defined maths, and so what ends up happening is when people try to kind of turn them into predictive models, they'll put something in, but it becomes very opaque very quickly as to what they've put in around social dynamics or presumptions.
Fail, right? It will probably
Yeah, it will fail.
tell you something that actually is not happening when you do it.
Yeah, but I mean, you've got to think about how models are used in policy, right? So, I mean, there's always a desire, and I think, this lure of kind of models, the lure of artificial worlds, if you like, and then models which are based on extremely dubious assumptions, which are invisible, or they kind of cover only one very small part of the system for which we've got data and hence can do some modeling and prediction, are used to justify things that have gigantic contextual factors which change the outcome, but they're being used to justify things. What's useful about this method is that it is completely transparent. So when we pull out a submap, we don't say, well, here's the facts. We sit down and say, okay, like, does that make sense? It's almost like a sense checking process, which I didn't talk through here when you do the analysis, in which you're kind of actually going through. It's almost like these are the assumptions that you've got. Does that actually hold water? So there'll be a sort of sense checking process at that point. Does this make sense with what we know and think? But I mean, it has to be used in that adaptive way. So you have to use this actually in a process of designing policy evaluation, where you're going to monitor in the system, where you need to do different sorts of modelling, and take other approaches. So it's what you call an intersubjective model. It is not a model that you use for prediction. It's a model that you use to really extend your thinking, and it's a starting point for other kinds of modelling, for other kinds of evidence gathering, whether it's social science or other sort of more quantitative forms. So it's a tool to which other forms of thinking and modelling can be attached. But again, you're constantly having to sort of pull people away, always when you do modelling for policy, from people just using a really incomplete or dubious bit of a number just to justify what they already want to do. And I think what's more difficult here is that because you can see everything that's going into something, if you profoundly disagree with that or think that something's missing, it's quite clear, So it's like making the thing very transparent, but that comes at the cost of not being able to make predictions in any kind of meaningful way. I do think models are super useful in this domain. Really simple models, actually toy models, just around the fact, it's like, oh, well, there might actually be a phase transition in the system, right? And no one's thought of that. No one even has the language to talk about it. So we might need to then how would we need to act differently? Or we might have this kind of effect if we've got all these individuals behaving this way. Maybe we get a tragedy of the commons. Oh, so I think actually almost like those toy models could be more useful in the systems in which we don't and are never going to have real complete data. And this is why I have a problem really with people using kind of machine learning in these really difficult domains in which we're really short of data to kind of, like the ultimate black box thing, to produce answers and to produce the sort of very convincing looking sort of answers where you haven't got data, you haven't got a model of a system, it was like the magic sort of
Yeah.
and I've seen really dreadful examples of that. And I think kind of a model that you are clear about its limitations and it's just a representation of everyone's thinking, and we know whose thinking went in there and whose thinking is missing, we can address that, is much better than a kind of really dubious black box which hides all of that and doesn't allow people to think about it. But the things work together. I think it's like, this is almost like the first stage in your framing of the system, right? I mean, like, here's then how you bring things together. But yeah, I mean, it's not a physical system that you're looking at here, so you have to work quite differently with it, I think.
The other thing I noticed is that you were kind of oscillating, sorry, but you were oscillating between And you would actually want to call it complex, so it's just complicated.
Well, I mean, so,
And in some sense, I think one could argue it's not complex.
well,
It is actually complicated.
you could make that argument. I mean, I think, you know, some definitions of complex adaptive systems would talk about the existence of long causal chains. There's certainly multiple feedback loops within these systems. I mean, I don't want to fall into the trap of saying something is complex, and what I mean is that it's complicated. I would say the obesity system is both complicated and complex.
What's the difference between these two terms?
So, I mean, complicated, I mean, I guess the paradigmatic example is like a complicated thing has multiple different components, but you can understand it by taking all apart and understanding all of those components, and you're going to have a good model of the interaction between those components.
Just imagine like a really high dimensional linear transformation.
Yeah.
You've got a
Yeah.
matrix with loads of numbers, but it's just linear, so all of them.
Exactly.
Really nice things.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a complex system, you know, like the non-linear interactions between the components, even with just 3 or 4 components, can make a system behave very differently. So what we've got here are systems that have multiple different sorts of variables, but they're still the interaction, I would say they're still complex systems. I just was kind of switching because I think I would say those are complex systems, but I don't want to fall into that trap. People often think when you just mean it's got lots of things in it, lots of different things, and that's obviously not what it means, which we all know.
Yeah.
But, you know, people often say that, you know, getting a man on the moon is a complicated problem. Raising a child is a complex system. So, yeah, Simon, hi.
So I have 2 questions and one comment and one suggestion.
Yeah.
So the 2 questions are, firstly, let's do this one first. Are you concerned that the process by which you produce these intersubjective models might have some dynamics of like social expectation, social pressure, all those kinds of social psychological things whereby people end up agreeing to something that they might not have agreed to if they had the chance to think it through themselves?
Definitely. And that's so, yeah, and you have to be really aware of that when you're designing your workshop process. You have to be really aware of that when you're facilitating, you know, if you see those kinds of dynamics. So, I mean, there's an art to this too, which is about kind of how you design and facilitate workshops. You know, you don't want to create a situation in which only very confident people can, you know, say something. And that's why there are different, I didn't go into the details of the workshop process at all, but there are multiple stages in this where individuals are working on what they think are important things or connections, and then the group is doing stuff. So we really pay a lot of attention to that. And there's also, you know, in this kind of practice, there's a lot of work, you know, there's quite a lot of paradigms in which you say you've got fishers, you know, systems fishers somewhere, and then you've got the government and their fishing policy, and you're not going to put those groups of people together in a room because the power dynamics and the stakes are so high that it's not possible, you know, it's not productive to do so. But, you know, you might design a process where people anonymously can say, this is how we understand the system to actually work on the ground, this is our motivations, and then show it to the government who's got a very different sort of mental model of the situation. So when you're doing participatory work, and you're super, there's lots of, super alert to that,
Second question, which I think you don't need to answer in much detail, is do you think there are any policy areas that should not be treated as though they involve complex systems?
Gosh, that's a good question.
It's not a very pressing one.
I'm sure, there must be some. But I mean, most things are, you know, in social systems. Maybe weather forecasting, it's not really a policy. I don't know, good question. Anyone got any thoughts? An area of policy that isn't complex system?
Well, without any kind of very concrete thing, maybe when it comes to policies that apply more, where principles do more apply than outcomes and social interactions. So if you think about international relations or something, and you want to go about it in a principled way, not just to kind of achieve something for yourself or your own nation or whatever. Maybe there are areas where it's not so important. Maybe.
So following the rule of law.
Yeah, rule
You
of
mean-
law kind of questions, ethical.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, right? Because I don't think you have to sort of, so again, I didn't go into it because just the example I talked to you about, but when we've got different things, different groups of people with different interests, and these, which you always have in these wicked problems, you have to do quite a lot at the beginning to work out what the different actors in this system want, because quite often something you're focusing on is where are the actual, where are the consequences of something that is done going to have negative impacts on other groups of people. And so trying to kind of bring in different perspectives and almost like highlighting those ethical dilemmas or the trade-offs, maybe in a sort of simplistic way, an ethical dilemma isn't simply a trade-off between different outcomes.
Maybe, and maybe this
It's
maybe doesn't
useful.
exist. That's right. Right?
But
Because everything is a negotiation and it's some sort of driven by different goals, and you can't actually even in that space you can't have absolute ethics of some kind.
There's no absolute
Yeah,
ethics.
right.
No. I mean, and this is
So
actually
maybe
this
it
kind of
doesn't
systems
exist,
mapping is
yeah.
quite commonly used by the military. Actually, interesting, they've got individual perspectives. But I would say that probably the rule of law in these circumstances comes to as an attempt to try to stop, in every the dynamics of systems of self-interested individual nations interacting, and we've made some decision that we want something different to that.
Yeah.
To that outcome.
But even those principles are pretty subjective.
They're certainly subjective, yeah, they're completely subjective.
Totally and whatnot, right? So I don't know. Maybe
But as we see it now, I mean, like those principles are also sort of.
Yeah, so maybe nothing's really governed just by principles. Right? So I should grant you that maybe. So I shall not there.
Yeah.
You had more.
Yeah, Simon.
Soon, yeah.
So I had a comment. I'm not sure I can articulate this exactly. It's basically to do with the idea that these models, rather than being simulation models, are more like what Michael Polanyi called maxims. So they are approximate heuristic articulations of tacit knowledge.
Yeah, I've not heard that sort of phrase used to describe it before, but yeah, and so this is why we call them insubjective models. But I mean, I think and what's useful for people involved is that they have to formalize their tacit knowledge in order to construct this.
But the point that Polanyi makes is that when you articulate, the whole point about tacit knowledge is it is fundamentally inarticulate, right? Because you're just using so many neurons, you can't push it. So he doesn't put it this. You can't push it into the bandwidth of just ordinary natural.
Well, that would be kind of quite interesting. Is like because you probably you can imagine you end up with some sort of link, but you can't really articulate like why you think it's there. But you could give maybe justifications or cases.
Or what you end up doing is you articulate something which is a rough approximation.
Yeah.
To the test, and that's what Polanyi calls a maxim. He says a lot goes wrong when people confuse a maxim with a rule, because a rule is something where you just take the articulation literally at face value, rather than somebody is trying to say something that can't be fully said, and they have articulated it for the moment like this.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely the case, and I didn't like talk about this at all in detail, but I think a lot of this kind of comes out in both the verification processes that you go through, where often you end up with multiple versions of a map. I mean, I think what you're saying is more fundamental than that, but I think it really kind of, it's important that these maps are treated as fluid, updatable, living documents, quick and dirty models. We shouldn't set in stone and then use for the next 20 years as the basis of our thinking Defra, or whatever it might be. It's like we go back to them all the time. We're like, well, we didn't really quite articulate that properly, or we've got a different perspective, and they should be exposed to as many different people as possible. So they have a very different sort of status, I think, these models, and the models that probably most people here are used to. It'd be interesting actually to think about like how this compares to sort of large language models and the way that they I don't know. I think it's the way they're interpreted. Yeah. Sorry, you've had a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you observe the intervention on this systems map.
Yeah.
How do you decide what part of this map to actually update? If some node changes
Mm,
and you see a change in another node of this network,
mm,
is that as a result of like the direct interaction between them,
mhm.
or is it somehow, you know, it could equally be some other sort
Yeah.
of less direct
Yeah.
causality there? How can you meaningfully update this map to reflect that particular intervention?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question.
What's your strategy for updating maps?
What is my strategy for updating that? So I haven't actually really got into the position where I have personally done that, like Defra has been doing that with these maps. So I would, it'd be interesting to go and talk to people about what their strategy has been, because I think, yes, you're absolutely right. You would want to sort of incorporate the same sort of questioning sort of approach, the same skepticism as you do when constructing a map.
Right.
You know, it's like what, I mean, these maps are really commonly used actually in policy evaluation to identify where we've just got no evidence. You know, and you'll find that there's evidence along multiple links, and there's huge areas of the map where you haven't got evidence. And I think similarly, like when the maps, if you're updating a map, like ideally you're in a situation in which you've put the sort of systems informed monitoring and evaluation process in place for the policy. So you're kind of gathering data on something that you think, I mean, obviously you can't update the map unless you've got data on it. But this should help you sort of think about what else you need to monitor to understand, like whether the causal chains that you've identified are correct or not. Obviously, in a kind of resource constrained environment, like that's an ideal that's not necessarily going to happen. Can't remember where I was going with this now. But no, I think it's an important question. I mean, and actually kind of in taking this further as to how you would actually genuinely do kind of adaptive governance and, you know, adaptive updating of models. But I will go back to Defra actually and find out like what their kind of rules have been for doing this, the evidence teams. So thanks. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's been quite long, so
Yeah.
thank you very much.
You're welcome. Very